Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last academic session, which is also the valedictory session of the National Conference on Recent Archaeological Investigation in South Asia, being jointly organized by Heritage Society and IQAC and Maharaja Lakshmeshwar Singh Memorial College, affiliated to LN Mithila University, Darbhanga. With us, we have our esteemed distinguished keynote lecturer, Dr. Amita Satyal, who is joining us directly from Nalanda University. I welcome you, ma'am. With us, we have also Dr. Anant Ashutosh Dwivedi, sir, who is also the convener as well as the Director of Archaeological Excavation and Exploration Department of Heritage Society. Welcome you, sir. Uh, Dr. Amita Satyal will be delivering her keynote address today in this valedictory session. I welcome all of our viewers who are live on YouTube channel to stay tuned with us. Dr. Amita Satyal is a historian by academic training. Her initial graduate studies were completed at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. This was followed by a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where she worked on networks of Asian trade and mobility with a focus on the cultural and ethical foundations of long-distance commerce. She has held research and teaching positions in India as well as the USA, where she taught South Asian history at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Her teaching and research interests have included socio-cultural history, history of water, deep time, all aspects of the early Buddhist tradition, contemplative practices, connectivity, evolution of early societies, and the emergence of networks. She has published on Buddhism in India and China, prehistory, the economy, and the ancient world. More recently, she also worked with school leaders where she had the opportunity to examine and reflect on the nature of learning and facilitation. She is currently visiting faculty at Nalanda University, Razgir. I feel very honored and it's my kind pleasure to welcome you, ma'am, to deliver the keynote address in this last session of the conference. I welcome you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Namaskar to everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I have been listening to all the papers very intently, almost all, and the ones that I missed, I try to look at the recordings as well and hear those. So I'm very grateful to everyone who shared their findings and their research, and certainly to the organizers for having me here. So what I will not do is to talk much about what others have already touched upon, and there have been great sharings on doing archaeology, interpreting, the nature records that have been found across contexts, across space and time. I am going to do two things, try to. One is to bring some of the possible directions for us to think about as we move forward, and also bring some of the insights from history into archaeology, so that the discipline of archaeology is even more rich. Now, let me start on a more informal kind of a note. I was, and like a dutiful historian, the context of the pandemic is something we can't ignore. So I was reading an online magazine, the Smithsonian, a few days back, and what struck me very intently was that, apart from this large scale of human suffering that we have seen, from the perspective of archaeology and from the perspective of interest in archaeology, there is some sort of a silver lining. One of the presenters, and Dr. Jha today also, they have referred to the fact that how excavations and records have come about in the course of everyday activities. So people don't bump into records, archaeological records, because from excavation alone, but farmers tilling their land, people digging wells, and so on and so forth can also yield records. So something similar happened in the UK. This was a lot of time to kill for people. So how to spend this time? You can't go out, you can't visit, there's not much that you can do in terms of work as well. So they did for the first time perhaps in their lives, which is to explore the safest, nearest outdoor places to them, and which was their own garden, their own backyards. And they started digging those places. Now, they weren't digging for artifacts. They're not archaeologists. They were only digging to take out the weeds, to air the beds, to plant new beds for their own plants and so on. So unlike India, where we work on the land primarily as a part of our livelihood, they were doing it more for a recreational purpose. But in the process, something very interesting happened. Not one, not two, but hundreds of people have reported bumping into some of the tools that can be dated to even the Neolithic period. So when I read this, it's what struck me was that there were two lessons that at least I got from this. It spoke to me about two things. One at a more general level, and I'm going to stop there. I will not elaborate that much. But the importance of slowing down, of taking pauses, and working manually. And today also there has been a lot that has been said about the need to go do excavations and so on. So I think the pause and the patience that this time has afforded us, if we can cultivate that, it will certainly be very helpful for excavations in archaeology, which require a lot of manual work and patience. But also, more than that, and I will draw now a connection with Mohammed Saab's introductory address on day one of this conference. And I think, something that he said struck me, which I want to start with. So as for all of us who heard him, we know that he traced the process of the recovery of Buddhist heritage at Nalanda, and being a part of that process itself, he himself, that is, gave some very rare insights into that particular narrative. But I want to highlight two things that come out from his address, and kind of bring those here today to elaborate what I'm trying to say. So the first is that, just as the process of recovery of Nalanda was incremental, it was in stages. It is spread over time. There are layers of time. Archaeology, at the heart of that discipline, is about time and its layers. So I think one perspective that we can take away from that address and bring into what I want to call developing an archaeological consciousness is that when we think of time as an archaeologist, we are thinking actually about layers of time. And the minute we start talking about layers of time, we are attempting to also look at the fact that there is a connection between those layers and how those layers are connected. So two things at the outset that I am taking away from Mohammed Saab's address and bringing it here for everyone to kind of just keep reminding ourselves that at the heart of what I'm trying to say is archaeological consciousness, is the idea of layers of time and trying to see the connection between those layers. So the one reminder that I would urge us all, and I think almost all the speakers have stressed upon that as well, and I just want to re-emphasize that it's very important to keep in mind that when in archaeology we are not just studying the past, which history takes pride in doing that, but we are actually studying how traditions, practices, and ideas changed over these layers of time, so that what happened for these layers to come together. If you look at the archaeological site, if you look at a record, you don't look at it in isolation, but I think you look at it in a context. And I think that that is at the heart of that archaeological consciousness that I'm talking about, where you think of time as layers, you think of connections between those layers, and eventually you are thinking of archaeology as in you're speaking to that record, you're speaking to that site in terms of what it can tell us about the past. So this brings me to the second point that I want to highlight, based on all the sharings that I heard, is that there are some new directions, possible new directions for us to consider as we move along. And I was so happy to hear that, to see and hear that there are also some very young researchers who are excited about this discipline and about this enterprise. And it's important for us to be aware that there are some new directions that we can think about when we talk about archaeology, and when we try to not only dig out records or excavate sites, but also classify those records and interpret them. So there are three areas that I would propose a lot of our particularly young researchers to start thinking about. One is that the minute you start talking about layers of time and you start talking about connections between those layers, could you try to bring in perspectives from network studies into archaeology? Because at the heart of archaeology is connections and connectivities and the connections between those layers. So if there is a possibility for us to think about how networks are embedded into those records that you are interpreting, into those sites that you are excavating, it may be a very fruitful enterprise in terms of the larger history, the larger human history, not just the localized spaces that we're talking about, but in terms of the larger human histories. Now, why am I bringing this up? I want to draw inferences from two examples. One is from Ladakh and the other is from Sri Lanka. About 4 years back, an Archaeological Survey of India expedition and some French, not there at that particular site, there was a very startling discovery, but something that has gone unnoticed. At about 14,000 feet above sea level, it's in one of the northernmost areas of Ladakh, that they discovered a camping site. Now, I've been there, not as a part of this particular expedition, but earlier than that, and there are camping sites all over there. What was striking about this was that it was a site that had a lot of charcoal on it. So because of the structure and so on, the archaeologists tried to get some dating done on the charcoal samples, and the result was startling. It turns out that we are actually looking at human mobility in that area for something in the epipal in 10,500 years ago. Since this dating was done at a laboratory which dates this site from 8,500 to 7,300 BCE, we are looking at 800 years of continuous use. Now, this will be the oldest site discovered in the Western Himalayan region. And not just that, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, if we start paying attention to all these stray studies and piece them together, as Dr. Vidyanand Jha today I think very importantly said, that, it is important to correlate. So can we also begin to correlate these smaller discoveries into our archaeological perspectives? Can we bring these smaller discoveries? And the advantage of that will be, it will not only enrich your own interpretation, but will also open the ground or pave the ground for further excavations in areas that have not been touched upon. So, there have been similar excavations in the seas. So the Sri Lanka example, the second example that I was going to bring, was connected with the history of Buddhism, early Buddhism in India. And it so happened that in 1885, Cunningham, when he had finished his excavations, so this was the Bharut sculptures that were going to England on an exhibition. And so these were the best sculptures that were dug out from Bharut. And the whole ship sank. Now, marine archaeology has been a big area, or rather, I would say, a growing area in other academies. But we have not been paying sufficient attention to that. Now, I know that there are a lot of constraints, marine archaeology. It requires a lot of resources and techniques and so on. But what I'm trying to say is that there are these unexplored areas. So now we have a treasure trove lying on somewhere around the north coast of Sri Lanka, about these treasures that have been permanently in the sea since 1885. And this is the oldest shipwreck, or rather, I should say, the shipwreck with the oldest records that has been found, and we have not been able to do anything much about it. So, apart from excavations in the areas that have already happened, what I'm trying to say is, through these examples, that there are not only other areas to be explored, but also insights that can be brought into our perspective. So we start thinking about, within even archaeology, about histories of land and water together. This kind of an enterprise is happening, in other disciplines, in history included. But I think it would benefit archaeology a lot, especially because it is primarily engaged in interpreting the record in terms of how and what it tells about us about the past. So the context of the record, its connectivities, the integrating, at least in your theoretical perspective, bringing in newer discoveries from what even the areas that don't seem to be directly connected with what you are studying, would actually open up possibilities, and I think it would make for a very interesting study, where you are talking about, by default, long temporal scales. I mean, the fact that, look at the site itself, the archaeological site, the fact that there are layers also tell us that archaeology, in a large way, is dealing with repetitive actions, right? It is dealing with actions that have been repeated by humans over long periods of time. So by default, you're thinking in terms of long periods. And I do want to remind us that that perspective of long time scales, large time scales, is equally important. So whenever, I would say, it would be more productive if we don't yield to synchronic studies. If we look at these multiple layers of time, if we look at these contexts in terms of their much larger contexts of networks, if we look at these records in terms of long time scales, archaeology would be definitely much, much richer. And the third, the area that I thought, which is very interesting and potentially has a lot of scope even for India, would be soundscapes, and how do you integrate sound and the study of sound into archaeology? How do you convert, rather, soundscapes to landscapes? And, you might think that sound, which is actually the mode I'm communicating with you now, is a very critical part of the human experience, right? So how did these societies in the past organize their spaces around sound? How and what function did these communications, the beating of the drum, the blowing of the shank, the conch shell, or communicating messages across larger spaces, do tell us about how humans traveled. How did societies engage with each other? So I'm stressing upon one point, which I thought would be helpful if our presenters and our audiences would think more about, is the relational aspect within archaeology. And I think it is important to move beyond the synchronic into these, looking at the record and the site as layers of time, bringing out the connections between these, and looking at how these patterns that are embedded in the record, that are embedded in the site over large time scales. So this is the essence of what I wanted to bring to the table in terms of the discipline and some of the newer or fresher insights that it could have in terms of enriching itself. I also want to point out that efforts such as the Heritage Society are important, because they and this has been touched upon by Dr. Jha today, by Mohammed Saab earlier, that local archaeology is an extremely critical part of this larger archaeological enterprise. And so it's important because here you have people working to get those records and who know the context of the record itself, right? So I do want to say that the efforts of local archaeologists are extremely important, especially that the perspectives that they bring about, their knowledge of the context, and in interpreting those records, I think will be very valuable to integrating some of the larger findings that are happening outside, some of the more theoretical findings, and then some of these findings on the ground. So I do want to just end with this, that the efforts of the Heritage Society or similar efforts need to be encouraged in the interest of bringing local archaeologists and local archaeology and perspectives from local archaeology into mainstream academic archaeology itself. So I wanted to make it short, and hopefully I have been able to kind of synthesize some of the important directions, and purely from what everyone shared. So it got me thinking as to what can be the major takeaways, and which are the directions for us to consider. So just to summarize what I said, I think it is important to start thinking in terms of developing an archaeological consciousness and trying to ask ourselves what it means, an awareness of the fact that you're dealing with long time scales. So do not try to, let's not make our studies synchronic. Rather, look at these layers of time, look at the connections in between these and amongst these, bring perspectives from networks into archaeology. Marine archaeology is another area. Then there are these, and particularly prehistory. I mean, that is somewhat an area somewhat needing more attention. So it would be wonderful if there are more young researchers who can also move into the deep historical, the prehistoric, as we call it. And it is actually only archaeology that can tell us the history of, say, 2 million years ago down to about 3000 BC. So archaeology has a very important role to play in this knowledge, in creating this knowledge. And I do want to stress for our young researchers to be aware that with this consciousness, you can actually bring to the table even more than what you're doing. but it was lovely having you being a part of the audience, and now being able to share with you, and hopefully there was something that will help you in what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your keynote address. I express my deepest gratitude to you for joining this session and accepting our invitation to join this session and give the valedictory keynote address. Despite having your busy schedule, you took out the time and joined us in this session. Yeah. I'm very, very thankful, ma'am, and I'm very grateful to you, ma'am, for joining us here.
Thank you.
Now I invite Dr. Anantasutosh Dwivedi, sir, who is also the convener of this session, a renowned archaeologist and the director of the Archaeological Explorations and Excavations Department Heritage Society, to present vote of thanks.
क्या मेरी आवाज जा रही है?
Yes, sir, we are able to hear you now.
मेरी आवाज जा रही है?
Hello. Yes, sir, we are able to hear you now. Hello.
हाँ, मेरी आवाज जा रही है?
Are you
Yes, sir, you are.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, you are audible now.
हाँ, मेरी आवाज जा रही है? Thank you very much.
Yes, sir, you are audible now.
शाम को तेलुगु राशि जगतपति ध्यानार्घम ब्रह्मा मुरारी शुक्र शनि राहु केतव सर्वे ग्रहाः ग्रह शुक्र। मैं अपने तमाम सर्वे दोस्तों को मैं यहाँ लाइव सेशन में देख रहे हैं और जो मुझे लाइव सेशन में आप रिकॉर्डेड वीडियो को देखेंगे, अपना सादर प्रणाम और दोस्तों आप रिकॉर्डेड वीडियो को देखेंगे। हेरिटेज सोसाइटी लगातार 3 महीने से लेक्चर सीरीज ऑर्गेनाइज कर रही थी। उस लेक्चर सीरीज की सफलता आप लोगों ने बहुत दिया, बहुत प्यार दिया उस सफलता को लेकर। उसके बाद हम लोगों ने यह निर्णय किया क्यों ना इसको कुछ युवाओं के लिए कुछ प्लेटफॉर्म हम लोग दें, और लगातार युवाओं का कॉल आ रहा था कि हम लोगों को प्लेटफॉर्म पे मौका दिया जाए, किस तरह से कार्य किया जाए कि ताकि तमाम भारतवर्ष के हर जगह से लोग स्कॉलर लोग जुड़े इस सोसाइटी से और अपना अपना रिसर्च प्रेजेंट करें। उसी में हम लोगों ने जो महाराजा पद्मेश्वर सिंह मेमोरियल महाविद्यालय दरभंगा में स्थित है, और उनके सहयोग से यह पहला कॉन्फ्रेंस नेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑर्गेनाइज किया, और बहुत ही कम समय में लगभग 5 दिन हम लोग समय दिए थे, और 5 दिनों में ही 300 से ज्यादा लोगों ने रजिस्ट्रेशन किया। इसके ऊपर मुझे बहुत आश्चर्य हो रहा था कि इतने कम समय में युवाओं की टोली पूरे भारतवर्ष और भारत से बाहर लोगों ने इसको अपना दिया कि मैं यहाँ अपना पेपर करूंगा, यहाँ अपना रजिस्ट्रेशन कराऊंगा, और इसके माध्यम से हम अपने रिसर्च पेपर को जितने फॉलोअर्स हैं हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के ऑल ओवर वर्ल्ड में, उनके पास मैं अपनी बातों को भेजूंगा। तो इसी को ध्यान में रखते हुए हम लोगों ने रिसेंट आर्कियोलॉजिकल इन्वेस्टिगेशन के ऊपर पिछले 29 तारीख से लेकर आज 21 तारीख तक लगातार पिछले 3 दिनों का लगभग 3 सेशन में हम लोगों ने यह कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑर्गेनाइज करने का काम किया। और इसके सहयोग के लिए पूरे ऑर्गेनाइजिंग कमेटी बनी थी, जिसमें हमारे मुख्य जो चीफ पैटर्न के रूप में थे प्रोफेसर विद्यानाथ झा साहब जी, जो महाराजा लक्ष्मेश्वर सेन मेमोरियल महाविद्यालय के प्रिंसिपल हैं, वे हमारे चीफ पैटर्न के रूप में थे। और कॉन्फ्रेंस चेयर के रूप में हेड ऑफ डिपार्टमेंट हिस्ट्री डिपार्टमेंट के इसी कॉलेज के हैं प्रोफेसर माधव चौधरी साहब थे। वे इनके कॉन्फ्रेंस चेयर के रूप में उनसे हम लोगों ने निवेदन किया था और हम लोग के निवेदन को स्वीकार तमाम। उसके बाद IQAC उसी कॉलेज के IQAC के प्रोफेसर है डॉक्टर मोहम्मद शौकत अंसारी साहब, उनसे हम लोगों ने डिस्कस किया, आपकी ऑर्गेनाइजिंग कमेटी में रही। इस तरह से हम लोगों ने तमाम लोगों को रिक्वेस्ट करके एक नेशनल लेवल का कॉन्फ्रेंस प्रारंभ करने का एक शुरुआत हम लोगों ने यहाँ किया। और इसके कारण हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के काफी भारतवर्ष में और भारत के बाहर फैले जितने भी हमारे फॉलोअर्स वॉलंटियर्स लोग हैं, उन लोगों का साथ मिला। विशेषकर आजाद के गुरफल नंदा जो इस कॉन्फ्रेंस के को कन्वेनर भी हैं, उनका लगातार हम लोग देख ही रहे हैं कि उनका सहयोग लगातार एंकरिंग करके उन तमाम इंसानों को डिजिटल प्लेटफॉर्म पे लेके आना, उनको एक्टिव करना, इतनी बड़ी टास्क निभा रहे हैं। तमाम लोगों की हम सभी लोगों का आभारी हैं और सबको सादर नमन करते हैं कि आप सभी लोगों का सहयोग किसी तरह से प्राप्त हो। तो इस तरह से हम देखते हैं कि जब सेशन की 29 तारीख को जब यह सत्र प्रारंभ हुआ तो देखा गया कि क्या एकेडमिक सत्र हम लोगों ने यहाँ प्रारंभ किया। एकेडमिक सत्र में उससे पहले एकेडमिक प्रारंभ होने से पहले हमारे पद्मश्री मोहम्मद साहब जी को जो हमारे कॉन्फ्रेंस के जो चेयर हैं उन्होंने वेलकम किया। और उसके बाद इस तरह से शुरुआत इसकी कॉन्फ्रेंस की शुरुआत हुई। उन तमाम चीज़ों को हम लोगों ने देखा और उसके बाद धीरे धीरे आगे बढ़ते हुए 6 सत्र हुए। 6 सत्रों में भारत के विभिन्न विश्वविद्यालयों के शोधार्थियों ने अपना रिसर्च पेपर प्रस्तुत किया। इसके बाद साथ ही साथ हम लोग यहाँ देखे कि इसके बाद इंडिया के बाहर के भी काफी लोगों ने, बांग्लादेश से भी काफी लोगों ने वहां से वो देख भी रहे हैं और वहां से प्रेजेंटेशन भी आ रहा है। और इसी तरह का आज 6ठा सत्र हम लोगों का धीरे धीरे समाप्त हुआ। पहले सत्र की अध्यक्षता नेशनल म्यूजियम से संजीव कुमार साहब ने किया। उसके बाद दूसरे सत्र की अध्यक्षता हम लोगों ने देखी BHU से सिन्हा साहब ने किया। उसके बाद थर्ड सत्र की अध्यक्षता जो वीरेंद्र नाथ प्रसाद जी JNU से आए। और उसके बाद चौथे सत्र की अध्यक्षता डॉक्टर उमेश चंद्र द्विवेदी साहब जो कि बिहार के म्यूजियम से रांची से रीजनल डायरेक्टर वहाँ के हैं डॉक्टर अजय मिश्रा साहब आए। और अभी राजेश पुरोहित साहब म्यूजियम से जो वहाँ डायरेक्टर रह चुके हैं, उन्होंने 6ठे सत्र की अध्यक्षता की। तो उन तमाम लोगों का मैं आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ। आपने मेरी निवेदन को बहुत ही स्वीकार किया और इस तरह का एकेडमिक सत्र की अध्यक्षता के लिए आप आगे आए। आप सभी लोगों का मेरी तरफ से आभार और तमाम फॉलोअर की तरफ से आपको प्रणाम प्रस्तुत करता हूँ। उसके बाद आज देखते हैं कि वैलिडेशन सत्र शुरू हुआ। तो मुझे बहुत आश्चर्य हो रहा था कि अमिता पटियाल मैम हम लोगों का निवेदन स्वीकार करेंगी क्योंकि उनका शेड्यूल बहुत व्यस्त रहता है, उनसे कैसे रिक्वेस्ट किया जाए। तो मैं उनका व्यक्तिगत रूप से बहुत आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ कि आपने मुझे इस काबिल समझा और हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के वैलिडिटरी टॉक के लिए आप आएंगे करने के लिए। और मैं अपने तमाम हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के लगभग 77,000 जितने फॉलोअर्स हैं भारतवर्ष में और भारत के बाहर लगभग 40% हैं, उनकी तरफ से आपको मैं आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ। मैं आपने मुझे ठीक है, मौका दिया है कि आपको मैं अपना निवेदन कर सकूँ इस प्लेटफॉर्म पे लाने के लिए। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद मैम आपका। उसके बाद हम देख रहे हैं कि ऐसे सत्र लगातार हुए और बहुत सारे रिसर्च स्कॉलर का अभी भी डिमांड आ रहा है कि सर हमें प्रस्तुत करने का मौका नहीं मिला, कि मात्र उसमें 47 लोगों को ही मौका दिए। तो मैं उनसे निवेदन करता हूँ कि आप लोग उदास न हो, हताश न हो, क्योंकि अभी तो यह प्रारंभ हुआ है हम लोग का सेशन, और प्रत्येक मंथ हम लोग नेशनल इंटरनेशनल लेवल पर तैयार करने जा रहे हैं, कि ताकि भारतवर्ष और भारत के बाहर जितने भी लोग हैं यहाँ आए और हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के ऊपर अपना रिसर्च पेपर प्रस्तुत करें, और इसका दूर तक इसका मैसेज जाए कि कैसे हेरिटेज सोसाइटी भारत ही नहीं, भारत के बाहर को भी युवाओं को मौका दे रही है आर्कियोलॉजिकल या आर्कियोलॉजी से रिलेटेड जितने भी सब्जेक्ट्स हैं उस पर अपना रिसर्च प्रस्तुत करने के लिए। इसी तरह हम अपना सभी जितने भी लोग हमें डायरेक्टली इस कॉन्फ्रेंस को सक्सेस करने में, अपार सफलता दिलाने में जो सहयोग दिया है, मैं सबके प्रति अपना आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ और सभी को चरणों में प्रणाम प्रस्तुत करता हूँ कि आप इसी तरह से हम सभी टीम का जितने भी लोग शामिल हैं इसको सफल बनाने में, उनका सहयोग इसी तरह से प्रदान करते रहें, अपना ऑफिस देते रहें, कि ताकि हेरिटेज सोसाइटी जो अभी पूरी इंडिया में इस तरह से अपना नाम कमा रही है, बहुत जल्द भारत की धरती से हम लोग पूरे विश्व के स्तर पर वर्ल्ड हेरिटेज सोसाइटी टीम जो सपना हम लोगों ने देखा है उसको कायम करने का, इस लेवल तक हेरिटेज सोसाइटी को भारत की न्यू से प्रारंभ करें और पूरे वर्ल्ड में हेरिटेज के क्षेत्र में अपना पताका फहराने का काम करे। इस सभी के लिए आप लोगों का आशीर्वाद में प्यार इसी तरह से मिलता रहे, यही हेरिटेज सोसाइटी हमेशा कामना करती है और आगे भी करती रहेगी। आप सभी लोगों का मैं धन्यवाद ज्ञापन करने के लिए मुझे प्रस्तुत किया गया है, तो मैं अपने दिल से आप सभी लोगों को धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करता हूँ, आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ कि बाद में भी जब भी हेरिटेज सोसाइटी की तरफ से आपको निवेदन किया जाए तो आप हमारी विनम्रता को आप हमारे विनम्रता पूर्वक जो निवेदन है उसको जरूर स्वीकार करें। और दोस्तों मैं आपको बता दूं कि अभी यह सत्र खत्म नहीं हुआ है, अभी यह सत्र तो एकेडमिक सेशन हम लोगों ने सत्र किया है, पूरे 29 तारीख को प्रारंभ हुआ, 31 तारीख तक चला। जो इनॉग्रेशन सेशन एकेडमिक सेशन टॉप चल रहा है, उसके बाद अभी मेन जो हर समापन की जो अंत में होती है, अंत में बातचीत होती है, कल्चरल प्रोग्राम करना, तो अभी स्टेज अभी होना बाकी है। बस सेशन जैसे ही खत्म होगा इसके बाद कल्चरल प्रोग्राम होगा, तो आप लोग उसको यूट्यूब चैनल पर जरूर देखें, इसका लिंक आप लोगों को उपलब्ध करा दिया गया है, आप जाएं, उसमें आप आ रही हैं बहुत देश जाने मानी युवा अदाकारा हैं, जो ओडिसी डांसर हैं, दिशा से आ रही है और वो महाकाली स्तुति के ऊपर अपनी प्रस्तुति देंगी। तो मैं एक बार पुनः आप सभी लोगों को धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करता हूँ कि आपने मुझे काबिल समझा हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के मंच पर आके हेरिटेज सोसाइटी के मंच को उस लायक बनाया और अपने रिसर्च सेशन से जितने भी लोग हमारे फॉलोअर्स लोग सुने उससे जरूर लाभान्वित होंगे। और मैं पूरी प्रयास करूंगा कि आने वाले दिनों में इस तरह के आयोजनों को लगातार भारत के अलग अलग विश्वविद्यालयों और कॉलेज के साथ ज्वाइंट कोलैबोरेशन में करके इस तरह का कार्यक्रम लगातार करते रहेंगे। तो आप लोगों से इसी तरह का स्नेह मैं चाहता हूं कि आप लोग बनाए रखें। और एक बार मैं आप सभी लोगों का प्रणाम अर्पित करता हूं। थैंक यू।
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for the very inspiring and concluding session. Thank you for delivering the vote of thanks, sir. It is really a great honor for me to thank both Dr. Anantasutosh Dwivedi sir and Dr. Mithila Satyal ma'am. In just after the end of this session, in a couple of minutes, the cultural session will start. So stay tuned with Heritage Society. Thank you to all.